Ms. Loria is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for appearing today. And Admiral Fowler, I wanted to start with you. I recently read a press release from Southcom that announced the completion of the LCS-1 USS Freedom deployment in support of JIADF South. It applauded the work of the ship's crew in counter-drug operations, working with partner nations to build interoperability and hosting a U.S. Coast Guard leadet to counter illicit trafficking. All in all, my takeaway from this press release was that this was a successful deployment. Would you concur in this assessment?
There have been some real bright spots with littoral combat ship deployments. You cite Freedom. It was a very successful deployment. They had a high operational availability. I would also cite the USS Gabby Giffords recent deployment, where the CO on his own initiative made a video for his crew and for his families that went public about their high operational success. So that capability has proven, and the CNO, Admiral Gilday's commitment to getting the maintenance right is making a difference.
So it sounds to me that you'd welcome additional LCS deployments in your AOR. But I also noted, however, the headline of this article was USS Freedom returns for final deployment. Even though the LCS can provide significant contributions in your AOR, the Navy wants to grow its fleet. They intend to decommission the first LCS in class. Do you agree with this plan?
The Navy shipbuilding plan has stated a capability and a size that the Navy needs, and I think it's recognized we need a larger fleet. How the Navy sources that capability through the joint process, to me, is I'm indifferent of what type of ship, but we need a ship. Zero is equal to zero or unsolvable in any equation.
Well, thank you, and I appreciate you noting, as we talked about last year, the limited number of ships deployed in your AOR. And General VanHerck, I'd like to switch and better understand the geographic responsibilities of the 3 combatant commanders whose AORs intersect at the Arctic. On the West Coast, and I'm going to focus on naval assets, you have a single combatant commander at U.S. Indo-PACOM with 100+ naval forces assigned Forces 4. On the East Coast, you have 2 combatant commanders responsible for deterring Russian aggression from the East Coast to the Barents Sea. But U.S. Northcom has no permanently assigned naval forces in the Forces 4 document, and EUCOM has very few, which are mostly focused in the Mediterranean. As U.S. Northcom, U.S. Fleet Forces Command is your maritime component commander. Is that correct?
That is correct.
But do you have operational control of those forces as Indo-PACOM does on the West Coast?
Ma'am, I do not have operational control of the majority of the forces. Sometimes I get allocated those forces to execute for short durations of time, but to answer your question directly, no, I do not.
Okay, and then in 2018, Admiral Richardson, then CNO, stood up the new version of the Second Fleet. And he said that the Second Fleet will approach the North Atlantic as one continuous operational space and conduct expeditionary fleet operations when and where needed. And so according to Admiral Richardson, the Second Fleet's area of responsibility crosses the Northcom and the EUCOM AOR, yet they're not Forces 4 to either combatant commander. Is this correct?
That is correct.
And I recall that the Harry S. Truman recently conducted operations above the Arctic Circle. What combatant commander was assigned operational control of the Harry S. Truman Strike Group when they were operating in the Norwegian Sea?
General Walters at the European Command had operational control.
Okay. So if I understand correctly, with the reestablishment of Second Fleet, we introduced a new Navy and NATO Joint Command that appears to have broad geographic responsibility but is not assigned to either combatant commander. And along with Commander U.S. EUCOM, you're given the responsibility to deter Russian aggression and activity in the North Atlantic, but you essentially have no assigned naval forces. Is that correct?
That's correct. Now, from a ship perspective, you are correct.
And so I just wanted to comment. I saw that Captain Mahler, the Chief of Staff at Second Fleet, recently said with regards to this process of standing up the Second Fleet, that we were given no blueprints, we were given no resources, we were just told to do it. So this command of Second Fleet, do you feel that the area of responsibility crossing 2 combatant commands has been effective as the Northcom commander and the overall mission that you need to accomplish in the Arctic?
Specific to the Second Fleet, I would defer to Vice Admiral Lewis there on that question. I will tell you that I'm closely
But sir, can I just stop you in the time I have remaining? U.S. Fleet Forces Command is your maritime component commander, and Admiral Lewis works for them, so he works for you.
And sorry, but the General Williams' time has expired. You'll have to continue this for the record or later. Sorry. Mr. Bergman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thank you all for your thoughtful, proactive leadership and continuing engagement. General, the Joint Pub 3-27 on Homeland Defense, published in April 2018, states that the purpose of Homeland Defense is to protect against incursions or attacks on sovereign U.S. territory, the domestic population, and critical infrastructure and key resources. The publication also states that virtually all strategic threats to the homeland are based in the areas of responsibility of other geographic commanders, and that major operations against an enemy in the U.S. remain, quote, highly unlikely. You can take any or all part of this question for the record, or however offer comments you would like. But are these assumptions in Joint Pub 3-27 still valid?
Congressman, I think the last point you made with regards to a likely attack on the homeland from a peer competitor is accurate, that we don't see indications of that right now, but we do see indications of peer competitors developing capabilities to hold the homeland at risk, which would influence or have influence on our ability to project power on our timeline. Specific to your first comment with regards to the majority of the threats existing in other AORs, I think we need to reconsider that. I think the persistent proximate threat is here, and it's here to stay in the future.
Is Northcom prepared to conduct operations in the homeland?
Day to day, based on current indications and warning, my assessment is yes. If indications and warning dramatically changed, then I'm going to have to ask for forces, and those forces would have to be allocated to me through the Secretary of Defense, at which point the Secretary would have to balance the globe based on threat and risk that he would accept.
Well, in that case, has all coordination with the many state and local jurisdictions been pre-coordinated, rehearsed, trained, exercised, et cetera, to allow Northcom to quickly and effectively carry out its mission in the homeland when an immediate response is required?
My assessment, if I understand your question, is do we need to practice and execute?
Well, anytime, whether you're active reserve, guard, whatever it is, you have a mission, you put together a plan, you get the people, get the gear, and then go train it, exercise it, see where you need to improve it or change it or whatever it is. So I guess what I'm asking is, are those cross boundaries, everything from who's in charge when you start mixing Title 10, Title 32, et cetera, et cetera?
So we do that on a daily basis, specifically with defense support of civil authorities. We do that with our CBRN response as well. We train that. I'm pushing hard for an exercise that is focused on a state actor attack on the homeland that takes a look at exactly what you're talking about. Historically, when we work with the interagency, we work from a perspective of us providing support to the interagency. I think we also need to look at the opposite, where there's a potential state actor attack on the homeland, where I am the supported commander in that situation, and we work closely about command and control across the interagency with the other combat commanders as well.
Okay, and lastly, is Joint Pub 327 in need of an update or revision?
My assessment, based on the comments you made, was we need to go look at it and update it to reflect the threat to the homeland that exists today.
Okay, thank you. Admiral, my colleague asked the question about the littoral combat ships. I'm going to ask a slight derivative of it in this last, and the answer can be simple yes or no. Do we need to consider other platforms other than LCS for use in Southcom AOR at this point?
It's staying engaged with our people is our number one, and making sure we're properly resourced there. So absolutely, and we're very appreciative for Congress's involvement in ensuring that we didn't get cuts last year in our defense attaches. That's our front line, our senior defense officials. So I think it's the capabilities, and there's none better than the U.S. service women and men.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Escobar is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, for this very critical hearing. And gentlemen, thank you so much for your testimony today. I represent El Paso, Texas, which is on the southern border. And I'm delighted that we're finally focusing a bit more on the Western Hemisphere, because frankly, the crisis is not at our border. The crisis is outside of our borders, all the way south to the Northern Triangle. And so it's really critical, I think, that in this moment where we can come forward with solutions to what is happening outside of our nation's front door, that we really examine where we've been effective, where we've been ineffective, and recognize this as a decades-long situation where we have failed to meet the moment over and over and over again, is my thought. I think the thing that we need to recognize is we need a multifaceted approach to addressing mass migration coming from south of us. As we have, as a country, limited legal pathways for folks, we should not be surprised that illegal pathways become an only option for people who are fleeing exactly what you have described, Admiral Fowler, with what's happening in their home countries. And so we, as a Congress, we need to re-examine what pathways we need to reopen, what legal pathways, and for refugees, for asylum seekers, possibly TPS. I think we also, as a Congress, need to acknowledge that many of those transnational criminal organizations that are trafficking drugs are in place in part because of America's insatiable appetite for those drugs. And so we need to look in the mirror, recognize our role as well. But I'd like to focus a little bit on those transnational criminal organizations and what we can do. I do think that again, going back to a multifaceted approach, in addition to opening up legal pathways, in addition to investment and collaboration with our neighbors. You talked about good neighbors, Admiral. I'm a big believer in that as well. And coming up with solutions together where there's not just investment but accountability. We also, although I'm not a huge fan of relying on the DOD for efforts like this, I do think that the DOD has a role to play. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are in terms of the opportunities that exist. I think we have to recognize we need a sustained approach. It can't be in fits and starts. And so we've got to really work with those neighbors closely and make a long-term commitment. We've got to respect human rights within those countries. We have to hold those countries accountable because those organizations have become more powerful and more sophisticated over the last several years. And the policies of the last 4 years, like Remain in Mexico, which is being unwound now by this administration, Title 42, which has been kept in place by this administration, those policies basically don't stop migration. They just create a sea of humanity right outside our front door that is victim to these organizations. I have heard accounts right across from my community in Ciudad Juarez about horrific rapes, kidnappings, persecution. It's horrific what is happening. And these policies basically provide that human fuel to these organizations. What is our first step? And how do we ensure that we uplift the human rights of folks who have been vulnerable for decades? And I have 1 minute, I'm so sorry.
The transnational criminal organizations, the first step is recognizing them in our strategic documents that they are a national security threat and a national security imperative. And as you cite, while I'm a big fan of DOD as well, we play a supporting and minor role in this, but a key role because we pull people together. An example of that success during the last year, we helped the interagency develop a targeting process to identify and then identify the right interagency or partner level to go after these threat networks on a more holistic threat basis. An example of the magnitude of the problem that you cite, 40 million migrants over the last 5 years. 40 million is the number total across the hemisphere. That is just an example of the scope and scale of the violence and the insecurity that is driving mothers and families to separate from their kids to seek a better life.
Thank you so much, Admiral. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Bacon is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate all three of you being here today in your leadership roles in defending our country. And I want to say it's great to see a 4th star on General VanHerck. So congratulations. I have 2 questions for General VanHerck and one for Admiral Fallon if time allows itself. My first question is dealing with hypersonic weapons. You know, ICBMs take about 35 minutes from Russia to reach here. China maybe a little longer, but hypersonics cuts that time in half. How can we support you better out of Congress in being able to respond to those shorter times? You need better sensors, better interceptors. How do we do a better job ensuring continuity of government with the shortage? I mean, there's a whole myriad of issues that we have to look at with a 15-minute response time. Thank you.
Thanks, Congressman. First, I would say go back to that domain awareness discussion that I had up front and create the domain awareness to have situational awareness on an inbound hypersonic glide vehicle or a missile and the ability to take that awareness and transition it into a defense capability. But more broadly, as I talked about previously, it's getting further left, and we need to utilize data and information, that domain awareness that gives us a picture ahead of any activity. And so we can take today's GEOINT capability from satellite imagery or signals intelligence capability or even open source from cell phone tracking to phones, et cetera, and give us a broader picture and a better picture much earlier before we actually have to be defending to create options to deter or de-escalate. And that's where we're focused at United States Northern Command and NORAD.
One of the things that concerns me is the continuity of government, having nuclear C3, confidence and deterrence. I know it's broader than just your combatant command, but with a 15-minute warning time and some of our stuff right off the coasts, I think we need to rethink when it comes to deterrence and having that assured ability to respond. A second question, do you feel like we're on the right track with the next generation interceptor program? And do you think it will adequately address the future threats?
In my discussions with Vice Admiral Hill at MDA, I do believe we're on the right track. I can't afford for my mission to have any further delays. I'm encouraged by the decision the Deputy Secretary made to move forward with that. I look forward to continuing to partner with MDA to deliver on that capability on time. Going forward, I remain concerned about capacity from the 10 October parade that we saw in North Korea to ensure that I maintain enough capacity for the total number of ballistic missiles that North Korea could launch at the United States or North America. I'm also concerned about their capability to develop advanced techniques to potentially deceive, decoy, those kinds of things. And that way, next generation interceptor will address those, both the capacity and the capability.
Thank you. Admiral Fallon, with China's GDP reaching ours, Russia totally modernizing its nuclear force, you have regional threats. It seems to me America cannot do it alone, but yet we're indispensable. We're going to have to do more and more to bring in countries with like values to help shoulder this burden. So what are these opportunities in your AOR, and particularly, how about Brazil? It's growing in wealth, growing capability. Hopefully they'll see a role for themselves in this area. Thank you.
The National Defense Strategy calls out strengthening our alliances and partnerships as a top priority. The new Secretary's guidance is right in line with that, as is the National Security Strategy, Interim Security Strategy. Brazil recently signed on a partnership with New York Guard, and in the last couple years has really worked to align themselves with our training and exercises in a way that recognizes their strengths and our needs. And so partnerships being 2 ways. The legacy that we have with Brazil that goes back to World War II and the capable fighting force that they have is an area that we are clearly looking at as we move forward as a way to enhance capacity. We're not going to outspend, we can't outspend our way out of this challenge of competition. We have to prioritize and focus on the right instruments with ruthless prioritization that give us the highest rate of return. And some of these competition elements, security cooperation exercises, Guard partnerships, need to have an increased appreciation for the value they bring for $1 or 1 hour of investment in time for the overall defense of our great nation.
Thank you, Admiral. And Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Crowe is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to start with Admiral Fowler. You had mentioned before that China is the pacing threat and a significant threat in your area of operations. So one thing you didn't mention at the beginning was just the threat of the climate crisis and climate change. Obviously, you're a career Navy man, and you know well how that's impacting our ports, our operations around the world. Would just like a brief comment from you on the impact in the near and midterm on the climate and your operations.
In the fall of 2019, I flew all over Guatemala with then Northcom Commander General O'Shaughnessy, and we were doing a partner visit to both Mexico and Guatemala, and then we saw firsthand dried white cornfields, endless fields dried and parched. In the fall of 2020, back-to-back Category 4 hurricanes within 2 weeks period on the same track, unprecedented, that flooded and wiped out what little crops were left across Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. It's a credit to Honduran security forces and Guatemala that they responded so professionally with such devastation. So it is a fact that climate is changing science. I believe in science, and it is a fact that that requires rapid response, and that's a military capability that we have, something that our partners need enhancement with, something that our security cooperation programs can and should focus on.
Thank you. And General VanHerck, similar question to you. Wondering about particularly the impact of a warming climate, climate change on the installations in Alaska. I know we're having some issues regarding our radar facilities as the tundra actually thaws out, the challenges the infrastructure. So a brief comment on that, if you will.
Sure, Congressman, I'll be real brief. You're absolutely correct. The permafrost, as it thaws, creates access problems to infrastructure we have for legacy warning systems, those kinds of things, which challenge us to get to those. It also creates challenges for us in building any future capabilities within the Arctic. We must plan for that. It has to be part of any strategy and plan going forward.
Thank you. And just to carry on my colleague Mike Waltz's comments about the icebreakers, I wanted to dig into that a little bit more because I know Russia, has over 20, I believe, and I can count. I don't even need this full hand to count ours. So I know you had mentioned your support for the Coast Guard plan. Is that enough? Are we on a right track to actually be competitive and to have the navigability and the access and the persistence that you talked about in the Arctic with our current plan?
My assessment is that right now their plan for 6 additional icebreakers would give me the persistence and the capability. That's a resource decision, though. If they are allocated elsewhere in the globe, then it may challenge me for my persistence. My assessment is Russia has 54 icebreakers, not only military, but overall military, or civilian as well.
Okay. Which is even worse than I thought. Thank you for that comment. And then back to you, Admiral Fowler. I, like many of my colleagues, recently went to the border to conduct oversight of the unaccompanied minor issue. Obviously, we need to go to the root cause because this, we set up these quote-unquote emergency facilities, but this is an emergency that actually happens every year at the same time every year. That's fairly predictable. So we have to go to the root cause and stabilize Central America. We already talked about the transcriminal organizations that are important, but in the predictability of our investment funding. With regard to the Northern Triangle countries, are there opportunities, do the conditions exist for us to expand our training and our professional exchange programs given some of the challenges with the government officials and the current governments in those areas?
There are opportunities working with the professional elements of their security forces and working by, with, and through our embassies. We take the lead from the embassies and our ambassadors and chargés on everything to look at smart investments. The exercise program focuses on their needs. It focuses on partner needs, rapid response. Along with that, we use humanitarian assistance authorities and money very successfully to do minor construction projects. For example, helping fix a leaky roof on a school, which is a skill set for partner militaries, It's a skill set for our Guard Reserve forces, which are our principal force providers, and it provides hope to the people. And so there are opportunities, and we're currently looking at our existing exercise program for the next few months and next year, and how we can enhance that in close cooperation with Secretary Solis and others to get this right. And so, yes.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Has expired. Mr. Gates is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to start by saying I'm glad that President Biden is continuing the good work of President Trump to end the war in Afghanistan. There was a bipartisan consensus, a bipartisan majority on this committee regarding legislation that would have limited President Trump's effort to draw down troops in Afghanistan, and I'm grateful that President Biden appears to be going in a direction more aligned with President Trump than the majority of this committee. And while that may not seem particularly relevant to this discussion about the Western Hemisphere, it is. My community is home to the 7th Special Forces Group. They have as their principal area of responsibility Latin America, and yet they have seen frequent, persistent, bloody deployments to CENTCOM. And so I'm hopeful that under this announcement from President Biden, that they'll be able to get back to their good work in the area of responsibility that I think increasingly calls for our attention. Admiral Fowler, you mentioned the importance of our partner nations, and I want to talk about the methodology of that engagement. One theory of the case is we can always be sending our service members down to our partner nations for train and equip missions. The other theory of the case is that we can do more by bringing some of those partner forces here so that we can collaborate and train and build those capabilities. What's your assessment about the cost savings that could be realized if we did more of the train and equip work here in our country as opposed to down in the jungle?
The engagement with our partners is so critical, and 7th Special Forces Group is a professional team that's culturally aligned and engaged day to day in training and advising, not accompanying. It's appropriate for the progress we've made, and they're doing it professionally, right, and along with General Clark's focus on professionalism and doing the right thing. And so I think it's a mix. I think we've got to go to partner nation countries. Sometimes that can be very cost effective, and it really gains the cultural skills that our teams need. And then bringing our partners here gives them an appreciation. And as I've been to the 7th Special Forces Group headquarters, been there, and they appreciate that two-way exchange. We learn as much from our partners as they learn for us, and that persistent and episodic engagement with the Special Forces team, small teams, 3, 4, sometimes 7, is key to helping our partners build that capacity and securing our hemisphere, our home, and our neighborhood.
You mentioned that we cannot interdict our way out of these challenges in Latin America. I would suggest we also can't decapitate our way out of them. As we take out leaders of some of these organizations, they seem to have quite capable human resources to be able to replenish that talent. And so it would seem that those partner capabilities are increasingly important. And it would also seem that we save a lot of money doing more and more of that here. And it has the added benefit of our service members being able to have their heads in beds at home, which I know increases their own morale and capability as well. I also wanted to ask about the Chinese Communist Party's investments in infrastructure in the Western Hemisphere. And Mr. Waltz went through those, and you busted the myth that this is purely economic. Could you talk about the infrastructure enhancements from the Chinese Communist Party that are most concerning to you?
Most concerning infrastructure enhancement and advancements are in space and intelligence assets. Would welcome a classified hearing at a future date on that. They are in IT and in the lack of civ-mil divide in how IT is viewed based on Chinese Communist Party law. Enhancements in port infrastructure, which could be easily scaled up, and we've seen how that has insidiously scaled up globally. And I think the world welcomes a fair competition and a fair access to the economic progress that we all need, but not an unfair one. And those advancements in cyber and IT.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful. One final question. ELN seems to be playing the Duque government and the Maduro government off of each other in some of the work that they're doing in the border region between Colombia and Venezuela. Any comment you would have about about how we ought to contextualize what ELN is currently doing?
I think the illegitimate Maduro government has synergy with the ELN and the FARC dissidents. They share a lot in common: no values, a lack of respect for human rights, and a brutality that is driving migration. I applaud the way President Duque and his Minister of Defense and team has responded to the challenge given the circumstances.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Brown is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question, two questions each for Admiral Fowler and General VanHerck, and I'll ask that perhaps you can take no more than a minute in each in answering each of the questions, and I'll ask one at a time. The first one is regarding the directive from Secretary Austin in late January, early February, for each command across the department to conduct a stand down for the purposes of discussing the problem of extremism in the ranks. So my question for each of you is, what activities have you undertaken or directed within your command to execute and implement the Secretary's directive, and what lessons, if any, have you learned and are you able to share with us today?
It's an important topic. It gets at readiness, it gets at cohesion, it gets at harmony, it gets at the necessity for all that to be combat ready. And these unacceptable behaviors, extremism, racism, sexual assault and harassment, just erode at that good order and discipline. And we can never do enough to get after that. And I think what I've learned is the importance of listening and the importance of perceptions and bias that comes into that. And whether we believe it or not, I think we all have them and we carry them with us. And we've done a lot to try to break down those barriers and look for ways to move forward.
General VanHerck.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. So we executed, and I personally led a session with the leadership in the headquarters that addressed the Secretary's guidance. Very informative. This is a leadership problem, and we have to apply leadership molecules to it. The rest of the command executed as well on the timeline that the Secretary asked. I agree with Admiral Fowler that the lessons are quite significant that we ought to take away: perception, realism. We led a diverse organization, a diverse group, and hearing from a diverse crowd on the challenges that are faced by those individuals is quite eye-opening. Thanks.
Thank you. And look, I agree with Secretary Austin. The vast majority of men and women serving in uniform, as well as civilian employees at DOD, embrace the values that we fight for and protect and value as a nation and a military. But even if you have a small element within the ranks that adhere to extremist views, we've got to do everything we can to discover it and address it. My second question, can you briefly describe the initiatives or programs or activities within your command that you use to develop a culture that values diversity, equity, and inclusion? And also, can you share with us the diversity of your leadership team in your headquarters? Thank you.
It goes back to listening, Congressman, and importance of including that in training. So our training and education program has embraced that. Human rights training, I think, is key to that as well. They're all really interconnected as fundamental human rights. The ability to approach things and have an equal opportunity in whatever aspect. And so as we saw the tragedy of George Floyd unfold last year, we stood up a diversity and inclusion team, and I picked a Brigadier General, Regina Sabrick, Torch Sabrick, and one of our civilians, Mr. Daryl McCarthy, to lead that we hold listening groups that are part of our training, and we feed that back into how to do better things in the command. Our leadership team, my deputy commander, civilian deputy commander, is an ambassador, Ambassador Jean Maines, female. Chief of Staff is the first female Hispanic admiral in the United States Navy, Rear Admiral Yvette Davids. And we have a deputy director, a one-star admiral, and I have a female. And then I have an African-American one-star deputy, J3. So we've tried to use what I would call the Rooney Law in our hiring within our own headquarters.
Thank you, Admiral. General?
Congressman, thanks for the opportunity. First of all, I think it starts with action, and your actions speak much louder than words. And so that's where we're focused. We continue to have sensing sessions on groups to expose and have a candid discussion about the challenges of extremism and diversity. With regards to what we've done, I did a climate assessment that concluded in January ahead of the Secretary in the office, and it gave us a good focus on where we stand today. We're going to conduct the Secretary's additional climate assessment. In my office, when you walk in, I have an African-American Master Sergeant, a Hispanic female, I have a female aide-de-camp, I have an African-American junior.
I do apologize. The gentleman's time has expired. If you had a couple quick closing thoughts there. Okay. Mr. Desjardins is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Desjardins is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. General VanHerck, as the commander of Northcom, you are tasked with defending the homeland. Can you describe the importance of maintaining strong, secure borders and defending the homeland?
Thanks, Congressman. Border security is national security, and we must have awareness of who's coming across that border and what their actual intent is. I think it's a security imperative overall.
As far as controlling the spread of the coronavirus, what does a vulnerable porous border do to your efforts to stop the spread of this virus and get the pandemic under control?
It certainly increased the potential risk because those folks coming across the border were unaware of their exposure, whether they've been vaccinated, et cetera. So I assess that overall it's a slight increase in risk to the U.S. population.
The numbers were pretty stark, saying up to 10%. I think the holding facilities I've heard that have a capacity of maybe for 33 are at 1,000 times capacity. So certainly that's not any kind of protocol that we've followed in the United States, and certainly shouldn't be following at the border. For sake of time, just a yes or no, do you believe strong enforcement of existing immigration laws serve as a deterrent to legal immigrants?
Well, as I said, I believe our border security is national security, and that the laws that we have on the books would be part of contributing to overarching national security when enforced.
Okay, so on the other side of that, you believe the weak enforcement of immigration laws can serve as a pull factor in drawing more migrants to our southern border?
As we previously stated, I believe it's a confluence of multiple things that are drawing folks to our border. From transnational criminal organizations to COVID to multiple natural disasters, to include the perception of a weak border enforcement.
Okay, so I mean, you believe that maintaining a secure border should be a top priority in our shared goal of protecting the homeland.
Border security is national security, and we must know who's coming across the border and what their intent is, especially for potential nefarious actors. My assessment would be nefarious actors that might want to do harm to the United States of America and our citizens. If there's a porous opportunity, they'll find a way to exploit that.
Yeah, well, the CBP refuses to release the number of individuals on the terror watch list that have been apprehended at the border. We can assume that the two men from Yemen are not alone in making the trip. What are the implications of this free flow of unvetted, sometimes highly dangerous individuals crossing our southern border when it comes to protecting the homeland?
I remain concerned about knowing who's coming across that border, and we work closely with Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection, FBI, other law enforcement agencies who enforce the laws on our border, so that I maintain awareness of what's actually going on with regards to the border. I'm aware of the reports that you're alluding to. I won't talk about those in an unclassified environment, but I will tell you the numbers are very small right now, but we do need to maintain an awareness on who is coming across that border.
And in 2018, when President Trump and Secretary Mattis deployed U.S. troops to support CBP and DHS efforts to counter transnational criminal organizations, human trafficking, and drug trafficking activities at the border, they were met with harsh criticism by many on the political left in Congress as well as the media. Can you discuss the need to continue fighting these transnational criminal organizations at the southern border from a national security and homeland defense perspective?
Well, Homeland Security, I would defer to them for the law enforcement aspect of enforcing what transnational criminal organizations do with counter narcotics and those kinds of things. We're in direct support of Homeland Security and Customs and Border Protection. Let me tell you what I'm doing. I have a fantastic partnership and a relationship with Mexico, Sedena and Samar, General Sandoval, and Admiral Ojeda. They're a fantastic partner. I'm encouraged by what I heard the President announce with regards to additional 10,000 folks from the Mexican military to help us get after this problem, Congressman.
Okay. Well, I mean, clearly from the reports that we're all seeing on the news, there's been an escalation at the border that wasn't there a few months ago. Do you agree with that?
Congressman, there's been a significant uptick of migrants coming across the border. In the last quarter, it's been over 350,000.
And a lot of this is created by the cartels and criminal organizations. And so certainly this provides opportunities to our adversaries, whether it be China, Russia, or non-state actors, to exploit these vulnerabilities. Do you agree?
I agree. It creates opportunity. The instability does.
Gentleman's time's expired.
Thank you, General.
Recognize Representative Carbajal for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for being here, and I look forward to my colleague, Mr. Desjardins, supporting President Biden's immigration proposal to address those very important issues. With that, Mr. Celestis, I want to take a moment to discuss DOD's coordination with FEMA and HHS to temporarily house unaccompanied children at military installations. Earlier this month, DOD announced that it received a request for assistance, RFA, to use land at Army National Guard Base Camp Roberts, which is located in my district. I understand that DOD confirmed it will support this RFA. In what ways does DOD support HHS throughout this process, from installation selection to when the first unaccompanied children arrive on base? And after the children arrive, in what capacity does DOD personnel stationed on the base interact with HHS facilities and personnel?
Congressman, thank you for the question. Currently, right now, we're at Fort Bliss. We're supporting HHS, the Administration for Children and Family, who oversees the sheltering of the unaccompanied children. We are also planning to use Camp Roberts. We work very closely with HHS, but the Defense Department, in particular, has no role in supporting the children directly. We provide facilities or we provide land. If we provide the land like we will at Camp Roberts, HHS will contract and develop soft-sided facilities there. They will provide all the services, the wraparound services, and they will provide the care for the children. So there's very little interaction from the Defense Department and our military members in dealing with the children at all.
Thank you for that clarification. General VanHerck, as the combatant commander responsible for the defense of the United States against rogue nations' ballistic missile threats, besides the next generation interceptor, what would be your top 3 priorities in the upcoming budget that must be prioritized to keep pace with the growing threat around the world?
As I alluded to, domain awareness is at the top, and that would include over-the-horizon radar capability to see beyond where our legacy systems do today. Undersea surveillance would be number 2 on my integrated priority list, to take a look and ensure we know what's going on to our approaches from an undersea capability. And then obviously that domain awareness and information that I talked about earlier to get further left to give us options before in-game kinetic defeat and give us options to create deterrence during competition would be the primary focuses.
Thank you. Admiral Fowler, I want to ask you about Brazil. In the past few weeks, the leaders of all 3 branches of Brazil's armed forces jointly resigned the day after President Bolsonaro fired the defense minister. All of this is very alarming. How have these departures affected Southcom's engagement with Brazil's armed forces?
I've remained engaged with the Chief of Defense, General Botelho. He's a professional, and we look at the future, and they're the professional force with values that we've shared and trained and worked together, particularly through programs like our IMET program, our International Military Education Training. So with continued investments in those types of programs, I'm confident that institution to institution, which was what we focus on, that we'll be together in the long haul, and the rest is a political decision and choices that people make.
Do you feel there's enough continuity there to give us assurances that our partnership can weather?
Ultimately, sovereign nations make decisions based on their own policy. What we can do is provide the best professional and consistent partnership from our standpoint. That's why it's so important we remain on the field. If you're not on the playing field, if you're not engaged, you're not going to be heard or seen, and you can't make an impact, and you can't make a difference. So consistency year to year, and then looking at where we can make modest increases to stay together. The education program is one where we could use an increase. It's a state-run program. There's more capacity there. But given what we've invested in to date, I'm confident we'll stay together as professional institutions, Brazil and across the hemisphere.
Thank you. And lastly, Mr. Celestis and General VanHerck, the Department and Northcom have been critical partners this past year in the fight against COVID. What lessons have you both learned from this past year, and what changes are you looking to implement within your jurisdictions going forward to be better prepared for a health crisis?
Gentlemen, I have to respond for the record. Gentleman's time has expired, and Chair recognizes Representative Scott of Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Admiral, I know that multiple members have talked with you about Communist China's increasing influence in the Western Hemisphere. I have a specific question with regard to that, and it has to do with money laundering for the transnational criminal organizations. And so could you speak to Communist China's increasing influence and what is happening with regard to the money laundering for the transnational criminal organizations? I also know that you lost funding of the ISR transfer fund. That is something that I'm interested in, and the impact that it has on you and your mission in Southcom. And then Representative Panetta hit on this a little bit, but the differing authorities that you have for humanitarian assistance and disaster relief compared to authorities that you have for security cooperation. So there's 3 questions that I have for you, and look forward to your response.
Our interagency partners here in the United States have pointed out to us, FBI and others, that Chinese money laundering is the #1 underwriting source for transnational criminal organizations. If you look at Southcom's area of responsibility, we have 8% of the world's population and 60% of the cryptocurrency. So there are active efforts to evade tough enforcement that the U.S. does and can provide when legitimate banking systems and methods are utilized. It is a concern. It goes back to the need to a holistic approach to getting after these organizations and metrics to do so. And big data and artificial intelligence, machine learning, DoD and Southcom play a supporting role in those overall efforts. With respect to the ISR Transfer Fund, it's a fund that was set up by the appropriators in Congress to augment all the combatant commands ISR. ISR is underappreciated by many, but not by us in terms of its ability for us to see and hear and understand the battlefield. That fund was not authorized and appropriated last year, and that resulted for Southcom in a precisely 38% reduction to overall funding for ISR. That's significant. We only have about 1% of the ISR. Intel drives everything, and without that intel, and that's in this year's funding, we are going to understand less of the battle space. The humanitarian assistance program has been key. It's a flexible program. It allows us to meet our partners' needs. In the past year, we've had, just in COVID response, close to 500 projects, $74 million worth, and we've been able to work 28 different countries. That has strengthened our partnerships. It wins hearts and minds, and it is responsive to need. It's about long-term capacity. Because of the way the rules are written and the authorizations, I can't apply that authority to work with a partner military force. I think that's a gap. I think we should look at how we could work that authorization so we can meet the point of need with our partners and work on a capacity. A strong partnership, whatever the country, is good for the United States. It is a good return on investment. I'd also like to see if we could look in our security cooperation programs, the 333 program and others, And how would we craft a small dollar amount, flexible military assistance program along the line of the humanitarian assistance program to allow combatant commanders to have a 21st century flexible and responsible tool that allow us to outcompete and win by meeting our partners' needs and focusing on our collective needs and our collective readiness?
Thank you, Admiral. And, you know, I would point out to my colleagues that you said millions. In many cases, we're talking about billions. We're talking about the whole Western Hemisphere. We could get a whole lot more return on our dollar if we focused on some of the areas closer to home, I believe, with regard to security for the United States. General, the questions I have for you many of them have been answered, but one of the questions I have a concern about is the ability to use small unmanned aerial systems to attack U.S. military installations. And do you have the authorities that you need to protect our military installations from these smaller unmanned aerial systems?
Congressman, we have the authorities over federal installations to protect federal people and equipment. My concern is that's a little bit of a reactive, and we're approaching this from a law enforcement perspective. Looking at defense, I want to get further, more proactive to be able to engage when they are detected through that domain awareness and further out when they are a threat. So we're working closely with the FAA and the interagency to get there with those authorities.
Gentleman's time's expired. Recognize Representative Spear for 5 minutes.
Chairman, thank you, and thank you, gentlemen, for your presentations and for your service. I was impressed by what you said, Admiral Fowler, about a little goes a long way in Southcom. What would you define as a little? Quickly, because I have lots of questions to ask you.
A congressional visit, a partnership exchange. This past week, I visited Uruguay. I was the first combatant commander to go there in a number of years. That visit went a long way to strengthen our relationship. So time is our most underappreciated resource, and one that I welcome an increased investment of in this hemisphere.
Okay. I have a very different view of the littoral combat ship than my colleague. And I'd like to drill down on this a little bit. The Freedom class is, in my view, and in the view of many, terribly unreliable, with the Little Rock, Detroit, and Sioux City all recently experiencing major propulsion failures. The Freedom class LCS may also have a class-wide defect, a flawed combining gear that breaks early in life of the ship. That will require massive and expensive taxpayer-funded reconstruction. In the meantime, the last administration increased the op tempo to new highs. So I'd like to know the following, and if you could just be prepared to answer them either here in person or subsequently. How much are taxpayers spending for each LCS deployment in Southcom? How much have LCS deployments increased over the past 3 years? A recent article in Defense News says that each LCS costs about $70 million a year to operate, and there's some 35 of them. So it's $70 million per year to operate, almost as much of the cost of operating a much larger Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. Is that accurate? But let me go on with my other questions, and you can answer them all at the same time. What is the impact of the LCS maintenance problem on Southcom's ability to complete drug interdiction and humanitarian missions?
Congresswoman, it's an important question, and the Navy's committed. I look at it this way. Those ships that came into the fight have saved lives across the United States. So whatever the steaming hour cost, we have saved hundreds of lives. Without those Navy ships, about 40% more drugs would have made it into the United States. The CNO...
Okay, I understand that, but let's talk separately from saving 100 lives in terms of drugs to the actual functionality of the ships that cost over $500 million apiece and then $70 million a year to operate and maintain. And when you said a little money goes a long way in Southcom, you know, I'd much rather see us spending some of that money there than on ships that don't float. And I would also say the Belt and Road Initiative, as you pointed out, is an example of how China has used $50 to $100 billion a year across the world in a way to benefit themselves exclusively, frankly. We tend to give money out in ways that are soft money that help the country. So maybe what we need to do is be a little smarter about how we invest in some of these countries. But I think that somehow relying on the fact that you're interdicting some drugs to keep these ships operating makes no sense. And at some point, we've got to recognize, and the department is very reluctant to say, you know, we made a mistake and cut our losses. And I guess I'm asking you to think about that and do that. And I have only 59 more seconds, so let me just move on to Mr. Celes's. When I was at Fort Hood recently, I went and visited some of the barracks. And I got to tell you, it was like looking at tenements. Now, beyond the barracks, we have 135 child care development centers in the military that are defined as failing or poor. Now, I don't want to send my kid to a failing child care development center. So even though 135 have been identified, only 8 have been fixed in the last 10 years. So my question to you is, how is DOD planning to spend the $2.2 billion remaining of the military construction funds that were diverted to the border wall, but were not spent? Will you spend that money on doing something on behalf of our service members?
Representative's time's expired. If you'd like to offer that for the record.
Please respond. Thank you. I yield back.
Yes.
Thank you. Panel will take that for the record. The chair recognizes Representative Wilson of South Carolina for 5 minutes. Mr. Wilson, you seem to be on mute.
Thank you very much, and I want to thank the panel for being here today. Everyone, your service is just so appreciated. I also, Admiral Fowler, want to share concern with Congressman Mike Waltz about the influence of the Chinese Communist Party on both sides of the Panama Canal. This is a threat to the people of Panama, and we need to be ever vigilant. Additionally, Admiral Fowler, I'm a grateful Naval Academy graduate dad myself, so I particularly appreciate your service, and I appreciate your update on Plan Columbia. This has been a real success story the American people need to know, working to stop narco-terrorists. And then my wife and I have been the South Carolina co-chairman of the Partners of the Americas program, working with the country of Colombia. We've hosted students to live with us, high school students from Colombia. It's been very uplifting. And in fact, my Naval Academy graduate actually was an exchange student to Callao Bennett in Cali, Colombia. So we have such a relationship with that country. And then I'm very grateful with the leadership of Adjutant General Van McCarty, former Adjutant General Bob Livingston. South Carolina National Guard is a state partner with Colombia. And so what a great opportunity we have working together, particularly with the tyrannical regime that now rules in Venezuela. With that, Admiral, I have a question. What is your assessment of the whole of government approach to countering Russian, Iranian, and Chinese support to the corrupt regime in Venezuela? What can Southcom do to assist the multinational efforts to assist the people and benefit the people of Venezuela?
Thank you for recognizing the Naval Academy, my alma mater, and I had the opportunity to speak to the class of 21 in the fall, and I would tell you, Congressman, that we should all be proud of the young men and women that are going to be today and tomorrow's leaders. They're just as strong as any other generation, and they make you proud. Under the leadership of Admiral Buck at the Academy and others, we're in good shape for the future. I am convinced of that. Thanks also for recognizing the importance of our state partnership program. South Carolina Guard is so actively involved with Colombia. There's ongoing exchanges. No one ever stepped down when the pandemic heated up, and we're working particularly to use the Guard's capability, the F-16s, as Colombia has stated, That is an important capability that they need, and they're willing to commit their resources to that capability going forward. That's the kind of investment that'll make a difference against Venezuela as they continue to isolate themselves. And you correctly point out the insidious and corrosive influence of Russia, Cuba, Iran, and China inside there. You look at that as an example, and over the last year, we see thousands of Cubans, hundreds of Russians, an increase in Iranian and presence, and then working in the cyberspace as well to control that information domain. We've got to work together for solutions that strengthen the neighbors, strengthen our partnerships with the neighbors, and isolate the Venezuelan regime, as Maduro has increasingly done himself through his human rights atrocities.
Hey, thank you for that response. And indeed, it is remarkable to see the success of Colombia and then to see what was possibly the most wealthy country of South America, being Venezuela, being reduced to destitution. And so what a great contrast. So thank you for your efforts. Additionally, General VanHerck, the Russian threat spans two COCOMs. What coordination do you take with the U.S. European Command to properly address Russia's military strategy?
Congressman, we work closely in partnership with the U.S. European Command through my various components as well to deal with threats to the homeland presented by not only Russia, but others that may come through our approaches that may include the European Command area of responsibility. It may include working closely with my partner right next to me, Admiral Fowler, that approaches that come from the Southcom area of responsibility, as well as Indo-PACOM, and working closely with our Canadians. So we work closely in partnership. I believe relationships and partnerships are crucial, and that Homeland Defense does not start in the homeland. It actually starts with the relationships and partnerships, not only with my fellow combatant commanders, but also allies and partners for each of those combatant commanders as well.
And again, thank all of you for your service, and we look forward to working with you in a bipartisan manner. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to both witnesses here today. Admiral Fowler, I just want to say your description of the, and you're in a unique position given your portfolio in Southcom, but your description of sort of the, forces, the external forces that are driving, massive numbers of people from their homes in the Northern Triangle, whether it's, the COVID depression that's hit the economy in that region, the natural disasters that were, I think, very underreported in the U.S., and of course the political violence that again is forcing people to make a incredibly difficult and high risk decision to send their kids northward. So thank you for that testimony today, because I frankly think coming from you, it's a really important message that people should really think about as we try to deal with the problems at the border. General VanHerck, your colleague from Indo-PACOM testified, Admiral Davidson, a couple of weeks ago, again, who's also dealing with sort of maritime challenges, freedom of navigation, which, again, are somewhat similar to what's going on up in the Arctic. Admiral Davidson actually was very, frank about the fact that he believes that the U.S. should join the International Law of the Sea Treaty, as did his predecessors in the EUCOM theater, same thing. We've heard that over the years. There's a bipartisan group of us. Don Young from Alaska, who also is supporting a resolution with me, calling on the Senate to ratify the UNCLOS. And I just wondered, based on what you're seeing up there in terms of the increased maritime activity and the competition for seabed minerals, whether you have any perspective or comment as your combatant commanders have made regarding UNCLOS.
Congressman, I would share the sentiment of Admiral Davidson. I support the accession to UNCLOS. I think it puts us in a more strategic position when we address these issues internationally, globally, with competitors or our allies and partners as well.
Well, thank you for that testimony. As I said, in this committee, we've certainly elicited the same response from other combatant commands. I think, frankly, that's the first time we've heard that from the Northern Command. And we are going to have a joint hearing with Foreign Affairs at the end of April to sort of dig deeper into this. It is really time that the U.S. get in the game in terms of being able to stake claims for seabed minerals as well as to protect freedom of navigation. We've had some discussions regarding the Coast Guard's involvement up in the Arctic, and I just would note that this committee was the one that authorized construction of the first large icebreaker a number of years ago. Again, the Coast Guard's program office in terms of shipbuilding just was really needed some help, and we provided an assist in terms of Navy's collaboration, which is continuing to this day with the Joint Program Office. But again, your testimony about the fact that we need to kind of boost that capability, I think, is also extremely helpful. Admiral Fowler, you in your testimony described the work that you're doing with your Sea Service colleagues in the Coast Guard, and I was wondering if you could talk about the offshore patrol cutters and how they collaborate with the Navy in SOCOM.
The Coast Guard is such a tremendous, important element of our engagement and countering threats. The recent patrol of the United States Coast Guard cutter Stone, a national security cutter, to get after illegal, unregulated, unreported fishing, with China being the principal state sponsor of this IUU threat, is one example. Tremendously reliable vessels. They're fast response cutters. The whole cutter fleet is top notch, and I'm a big supporter. Tremendous readiness, and they've done a great job for us. Additionally, another sort of example I'd cite, Congressman, is some of our Navy patrols, and I call them patrols because they're short duration. It's exactly the kind of focused, small investment that goes a long way. The USS Vermont's deployment to patrol to Brazil, where we worked joint exercises and capability demonstrations, was exactly in line with what we need to do to prepare for the future and increase our own crew's readiness.
Well, thank you, Admiral. Again, Mr. Chairman, just for the record, the USS Vermont is our newest Virginia-class submarine, which was commissioned in the middle of COVID up in Groton last summer. So I thank you for the mention, and I'll certainly pass along your compliments to the shipyard. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you for your situational awareness, gentlemen. Appreciate you being here. We have two more at the moment. That does not mean that someone might not come back in the next 10 minutes. But for now, we have Mr. Fallon. Mr. Fallon, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate it. Southcom is responsible for the region that covers 31 countries in Central and South America. And the thing that concerns me is the drug trafficking, because they seem to be every year increasing in wealth and power and influence. And it's clearly a major national security threat. It presents, I think everybody here would agree that it presents a clear and present danger to our country. And under the prior administration, the border, it had been a flood and it reduced to a trickle in large measure. And now, unfortunately, it's back to a flood. I was at the Donna holding facility a couple weeks ago where we're supposed to be 250 people in the facility, and there were 4,377, and there were 3,700 unaccompanied minors. There were pods where they had these unaccompanied minors, and they were sectioned off, and they had segregated them by gender and then roughly by age. And in each pod, there was supposed to be 32 children, and unfortunately, there were 500. And the Border Patrol was babysitting these kids, and that was their term for it. And Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador have 34.5 million people. That is an inexhaustible amount of human folks. And it's a long way to travel. I believe it's about roughly 1,200 miles from Central America to the United States. And, it begs the question, how do they get here? Do they owe, and who do they owe for the transit? Are the traffickers facilitating this? And the reason why we mention this is the Border Patrol agents were telling us the cartels love this crisis because it makes it very much easier for the cartels to do their business of smuggling illicit drugs, because almost half of the Border Patrol are in these facilities changing diapers and what have you. And so I wanted to ask if the Southcom commander, if he does agree that this is a clear and present danger, the drug trafficking and the cartel's power and influence, and sir, in your opinion, what's the best way to combat the Mexican drug cartels and the other drug traffickers and organized crime in Central America and reducing their power?
Transnational criminal organizations are exactly as you state, Congressman, a national security threat, killing people in your home state and in my hometowns, Pennsylvania as well. And they are fueled by a tremendous amount of resources, money, multi-billion-dollar a year industry, and drugs are actually not their top source of revenue. It's illegal mining, it's illegal businesses, it's extortion, it's human trafficking, it's arms trafficking, it's PPE, illicit PPE, and COVID supplies, and everything to carry forward their influence and access. They're fueled by corruption. So the best way of stopping this is a whole government approach, whole nation approach, and empowering our partners with the right tools. And one of them is good judicial systems that do the right thing and operate in accordance with the rule of law. These, and I've talked to these partners, the narco-terrorists, they fear the U.S. judicial system. They need to fear their home country's judicial system too, because they need to have instilled in them the deterrent model that they're going to be held accountable for their murderous behavior and the violence that is driving people to leave their homes and make that treacherous trip.
You know, and Admiral, to echo your point too, according to the Department of Justice in 2018, the most dangerous country on the planet, if you define that by murders per 100,000, weren't, if you asked a regular American, and quite frankly, I had the impression that it was going to be maybe a country like Yemen, Afghanistan, Somalia, or Iraq, but it's in this hemisphere, and it was El Salvador. At 50 murders per 100,000. Honduras was closely behind at 40, and Guatemala was at 22.5. And to give that context, Mexico is at 26, the United States is at 5, and a very safe country like Denmark is only at 1. So it seems that the more power that the drug cartels have, the less GDP growth they have and the more violence. And it's something that we just have to address. I think it is the #1 right now topic that we must, and it is the greatest national security threat. It's an economic drain as well on our country. And I hope that we can work in a bipartisan fashion to solve it, because we have the resources to do so. It's just a question of we have the political will. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, and appreciate that. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. I would note that Representative Smith did say there were 2 more, but we had additional people show up, so it'll be more than 2 more. So just a heads up. First off, I'll come back to you, Admiral Fowler, but it's good to see you again. It's always good to see you. General VanHerck, thanks for the conversation yesterday. I'm really pleased to hear my colleagues talk about the Arctic, something I've been talking about for the last 20 years. So welcome aboard, everybody, on the concerns we have about the Arctic. And I want, what I didn't hear today, though, is I've had a briefing from the Air Force on the Arctic. I've had a briefing from the Coast Guard. I've had a briefing from the Navy. What I haven't had is the DoD briefing. That is the umbrella strategy about what we're doing in the Arctic. And I wanted to hear from you, General, about Northern Command's view of that. Is there a broader strategy, or as you said on page 12 of your testimony, with regards to data, getting a hold of data, breaking down stovepipes is achievable? Do we have a stovepipe approach on our strategy in the Arctic with regards to the DoD? And what do we do to break those down?
So the department did put out a strategy in 2019 for the Arctic, and followed by each of the services. I also put out a strategy this winter as well. My strategy is not focused specifically on the Arctic, but the Arctic figures in heavily to my strategy at the U.S. Northcom and NORAD as well. I do think there's more we can do as a group focused on the Arctic to collaborate. It's not just a Northcom problem, it's a EUCOM problem, it's an Indo-PACOM problem, it's an ally and partner problem with multiple nations, and I think that's how we should approach it, from a global problem, to ensure that that we approach and compete in the Arctic to keep the international rules-based order that we've had in the past.
I think what we'll learn too, as folks look into it more, is that there's not one Arctic. It's easy to do operations, a little easier to do operations in the Barents Sea or in north in Norway, because the water's a lot more free of ice year-round than it is in our part of the Arctic. And so we really need to be thinking about what's the appropriate presence, what's the appropriate persistence that we need up there. And on that point, can you expand a little bit more on gaining knowledge to the left of action, or the all-domain dominance and the decision superiority? What does that mean for us when we look at the budget?
Well, that means having sensor capabilities that will allow us to see further than we have in the past, that will allow us to take data that much of it exists today and share that data, although it's in stovepipes where there may be laws or policies that don't allow us to share that data and information. I believe data and information is a strategic asset that will enable us to, no kidding, win in the future in conflict if we have to, but more importantly, take us further left into competition to deter and de-escalate in crisis. And so what I hope we see when the 22 budget comes out is domain awareness capabilities such as over-the-horizon radars, undersea capabilities, and a focus on the ability to take that information and share it. What you would hear the department talk about is joint all-domain command and control, if you put a bow around what I've been talking about.
Yeah, and also this begs the question though about you get all that data, then what? I mean, you're the dog who caught the car, so what do you do with it now? So I think looking at maybe one of the subcommittees that we have, the CITI, looking at the role of AI and machine learning and the applications, the algorithms need to be written to gather that information and pick through it for you to give you decisions is a critical part, which may not be your budget, but it's still an important part of the DoD's efforts.
Congressman, I concur. We have to move forward with machine learning and artificial intelligence from a policy perspective and get our arms around this. What we can't do is field capabilities and then wait till the end and we don't have our arms around the policy or the laws that go with it that enable us to support it. What you do with this information, in my mind, is you give it to decision makers all the way from the tactical level that may be pulling a trigger, but more importantly, what I see is the operational level and the strategic level that you can take action on. Me as an operational commander could posture forces to create deterrence, or the President or the Secretary of Defense could use messaging to create deterrence as well.
Right. Admiral Fowler, be really quick here. IUU fishing is important for us in the Northwest because of the Gulf of Alaska and problems we have with not just Russians, but Chinese and others. Why is IUU fishing an important issue? Be very specific why it's important in Central and South America.
Food security is national security for any nation, and when nations are losing their food stocks, their fishing, it's impacting their life, it's driving insecurity, it's all connected, and we play a role. Domain awareness is key there, helping people see on and across the sea.
Thank you very much. Yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's great to have you all here. General VanHerck, congratulations to your promotion into this position. I look forward to seeing you in Colorado Springs one of these days when the COVID protocols make it that easier. But I'd like to ask you a little bit more about missile defense. And I believe you are of the opinion, as are all the experts who look at North Korea's threat, that while we can address that currently, starting around 2025, if current projected rates of their progress come true, that we start encountering greater risk. And so I know that you're in support of an NGI, Next Generation Interceptor, to hopefully have by the end of this decade. In the meantime, do you support an underlayer or layered homeland defense with things like the Standard Missile 3-2A, SM-3-2A, and other assets that would give us an interim additional layer of protection?
Congressman, thanks for that question. I think there's tremendous value in looking at the possibility of an underlayer. I know you're aware of the recent SM-3 test that proved incredibly successful. As you said, I'm comfortable where we are today. But as we go forward, there will be additional capabilities developed to hold our homeland at risk, and an underlayer would give us additional capacity and capability to do that. If we do create an underlayer or additional sensors and capabilities to support that, it should not be focused on a single threat such as a ballistic missile. That underlayer, a layered defense of the homeland, should focus everything from small UAS all the way to ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and everything in between. We can't afford any longer to build stovepipe systems which have capabilities for only one threat. We need to look more broadly at these systems to achieve affordable solutions to defend the homeland.
Okay, thank you for that answer. And you mentioned cruise missiles. Let's talk about that. What do we need to do to better protect ourselves from that particular very dangerous threat?
Congressman, the first thing I'm working on is getting a policy on what must we defend kinetically in our homeland. I would tell you that it looks something along the lines of continuity of government, our nuclear capabilities, command and control, ability to project power forward in our defense industrial base. That would defend against a cruise missile kinetic kind of capability. But I'll go back to where I'm focused in domain awareness. And I don't want to be shooting cruise missiles down in our homeland. And that's why it's so important to have these domain awareness capabilities, using information, machine learning and artificial intelligence to get further left of that launch so we then create options for deterrence and de-escalation much sooner in competition. We also need to balance our focus between planning, strategy, force management, force development from a conflict focus and more balanced on a competition focus as well, and competition globally across all domains. But in-game defeat is not where I want to be. We need to figure out what that looks like, but I want to get further left and give our decision makers options.
And I know we're in an open setting here, but can you be more specific about going to the left and having these additional options?
Yeah, so going left it means getting information sooner to make decisions. So for example, our satellite capability, our GEOINT, our signals intelligence capability comes from National Security Agency, or even open source information from social media, for example. Oftentimes that information is not analyzed in a timely manner to have decision makers make a decision. So getting further left means taking that information, making it readily available by having policy and laws that allow us to do that, and then sharing it, and taking machine learning capabilities and artificial intelligence to rapidly analyze and process in near real time, and then sharing it with decision makers. That will give us the opportunity to be further left. I can give you a specific example. So if you take a look at a parking lot over and over that supports a submarine base, for example, the machine will figure out how many cars are in the parking lot. And when you start to see changes and you couple that with cell phone data or information through social media, you can build a picture. Now it gives us the ability to take action much sooner.
And also, General, lastly, you've talked about making sure we have the authorities in place that we need, and that I think the implication is that we don't have all those authorities. What are some specific authorities that maybe when we're looking at the NDAA this year, we should consider that make your job easier?
I believe we need to take a look at intelligence sharing. Intelligence should be part of our overall deterrence factor. And what we share and reveal and conceal, for example, if you don't know about it, it's not creating any deterrence effects. But sometimes our policies or laws may hinder us from sharing that information.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to stop at 2. We've got Mr. Langevin, we've got Mr. Khanna. All right, I lied. We're going to stop at like 2:02. But Mr. Langevin and Mr. Khanna are going to be last. And so we are done at that point. Mr. Langevin is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank our witnesses for your testimony today. We've covered a lot of ground today in looking at national security challenges and U.S. military activities in North and South America. I guess what I'd like to start with, if we could, with General VanHerck. As we look to increase non-kinetic options available for homeland defense, how do you plan to incorporate things like emerging technologies such as directed energy, hypersonics, and artificial intelligence?
Well, absolutely. We must take machine learning, artificial intelligence, and innovative technologies and factor them into every homeland defense strategy, plan, policy. I believe that everything that we do from now on, based on the threat to the homeland, from strategy plan, force management, force design, acquisition, and budgets ought to start with a discussion about what's the potential impact to homeland, what is the potential impact to a risk of strategic deterrence failure. We must incorporate those the technologies as we go forward.
So in further discussion too on, say, information sharing, let me also talk about communications. When you talk about left-of-launch deterrence, how important are secure and robust command and control systems in this strategy, and how do other federal agencies contribute to this strategy?
Secure capabilities are an imperative, Congressman. We have to go down that path with encrypted capabilities going forward to ensure that we have access to that data and information. That is an imperative that General Nakasone talks about routinely from his Cybercom and NSA hat as well.
And for Mr. Salises, so the COVID response demonstrated that homeland chemical and biological scenarios demand a whole-of-government response. What are the major investments DoD made in interagency coordination, and how do you plan to sustain those gains beyond the current pandemic?
Thanks, Congressman. I think the first thing is our ability to detect and surveil the kinds of biological threats that we face in the future, to include pandemics, our ability to do that more effectively. And beyond that, it's certainly working with the laboratories as we have to develop the kind of countermeasures that we need to protect our population against those kinds of threats.
It's important to incorporate those lessons learned and make sure that they're institutionalized. This isn't going to be the last challenge that we face, biologically, man-made or otherwise, that we see. For all three, I think we've touched on this a bit, but I'm going to ask it directly. Do you believe that climate change is undermining your command's core mission, or at least complicating it? And if yes, then how?
I believe in the science of climate change, and it has made rapid response imperative in our exercise, our training programs, and to the extent that it has caused us to respond to support partners, humanitarian assistance, and disaster relief, it's a fact. The point you make about secure communications, that has a role here too. So our ability to talk to our partners as part of this joint all-domain command and control concept that my shipmate General VanHerck talked about is so key. So we've got to get that right, and the vision that the Air Force and Lieutenant General Krall, the Joint Staff J6, have to encompass partners at the right scalable level in the future is key. We can't talk to our partners secure. We can't respond rapidly to that catastrophic event. And we were challenged to talk to them in some respects last fall when those two major hurricanes hit.
Thank you.
Congressman, I'll go next. To specifically answer your question, I'm not sure it undermines our ability to accomplish our mission. What I think it does is environmental change creates opportunities and it creates vulnerabilities. The question is, are we postured to take advantage of the opportunities and to plug any vulnerabilities that may create for us?
And Salises?
Obviously, climate change is having a big impact. We've talked about the Arctic a lot today. We talk about sea rise. We talk about all those things. For the Defense Department, it is the vulnerabilities that are created from these efforts. And our work here in the homeland in particular, as we've seen the severity of storms and wildfires and those types of things, it drives additional requirements on the Defense Department in support of our federal partners.
Thank you. We can't underscore enough how we need to think holistically about how climate change is affecting U.S. national security. I think it was Admiral, you talked about how climate change affecting food supplies, food stocks, creates instability. That creates problems for international security and where the U.S. has to get involved. So that, my time's expired, I'll yield back. Thank you all.
Thank you. Mr. Khanna is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this important hearing. Admiral Fowler, one of the causes of our border crisis is the rampant human rights abuses in El Salvador, in Guatemala, and in Honduras. As you know, the state foreign ops bill specifically forbids any foreign military financing aid to these countries that have had oppressive practices. Does Southcom intend to make sure that we aren't having Section 333 programs in the Northern Triangle in light of the state foreign ops bill?
Congressman, every program we apply the principles of the Leahy Law and the processes, and our human rights training and programs are embedded in every single one of those. And we are making a difference with those security institutions over time as part of U.S. government, whole of government efforts, working with our embassies. And so we are committed to that working forward. In addition to the human rights programs, we have ramped up our Women, Peace, and Security program, which is another part of the fundamental rights enshrined in the various constitutions of all these countries. So it's extremely important.
Thank you, Admiral. But specifically on Section 333 programs, are we still doing them with those countries, or we're not? And can you just address that as it relates to the state foreign ops bill?
I think to be heard and seen, we've got to stay engaged, and those programs allow us to stay engaged. And so we are continuing with the 333 programs. We're following all the guidelines that are set out for the right vetting and the right rule sets. I think we're going to have modeled responsible behavior better if we stay engaged with those programs, Congressman.
And maybe we can explore it after the hearing, just to make sure that the equipment that's being given to these countries isn't in violation of the state foreign op. But I think more broadly, there are many people in Congress who are concerned that the ongoing drug war is actually hurting American safety, that it is one of the causes for the mass migration to our border, because you have these military governments in Honduras, in Guatemala, in El Salvador, basically justifying oppression in a desire to crack down against drug lords or drug cartels captured by drug cartels. We've seen in Uruguay, where you've had a move towards legalizing and decriminalizing drugs, a more stable democracy, and we don't have many Uruguay migrants coming to our border. Mr. Salesses, could you speak to the possibility of rethinking this drug war if we really are serious about lessening migrants coming to our border?
Congressman, I think we've heard this today several times, the importance of a whole-of-nation approach to this. The Defense Department certainly can play a role in helping, but it also takes the diplomatic, the economic, the information, the law enforcement, all of that, and our partners in the South working together, too, to rethink this. And I think that approach can be very successful. I do think the work that the Defense Department is doing down in Central and South America is key, though. As Admiral Fowler has repeated several times today, it's the value system, it's our professionalism, it's what the U.S. military brings to the region and provides to the militaries down there with security cooperation, foreign military sales, education, institutional reform. Those kinds of initiatives make a huge difference in that region and need to continue.
One final question, Mr. Chairman. I'm one of 80 co-sponsors on the Berta Cáceres Human Rights Act, and that would suspend our law enforcement aid to some of these military regimes, consistent with Leahy and what Senator Merkley are proposing in the Senate, just making sure that American tax dollars aren't going to repressive human rights practices that are then causing migrants to come to our border. Do you have a view on the Berta Cáceres Human Rights Act and any thoughts on it?
Keep talking to me.
I think the human rights is a...
Mr. Salesses, or... Yeah.
I think the human rights is a focus we need to continue. I worry that if we abandon our partners, that Chinese malign influence will take over, and that's a view of human rights I don't think any of us want in our neighborhood.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I think that is the balance is very difficult to strike. We want to maintain those relationships, but we don't want to encourage, we won't give support to human rights violations. On the other hand, no nation, including our own, is perfect. So how do we strike that balance? Because if we just cut them off, like you said, they're going to turn to others, and then we don't have any influence. So how do we balance that? I think I know we always try to strike that balance in this committee. With that, I really want to thank our witnesses above and beyond, staying with us for 3 hours without a break, I might add. And as you can see, members have a great deal of interest in your areas of responsibility. There are incredibly important policy decisions we have to make, and I found this enormously helpful to all of us to get your expertise and background on how we should approach those challenges. Look forward to continuing to work with you. And with that, we are adjourned.